About a Man Who Wanted to Be in Love. Saroyan was a product of his times. Going back and looking through early stories, you can see how they reflect many of the social mores of the day, as well as elements of Saroyan's own journey. Reading About a Man Who Wanted to Be in Love raises some difficult questions about both the era and Saroyan's worldview. The story begins, simply enough, with a man called Gordon Kirker. He has not been in love for an extended period, and thus he toys with the idea of killing himself. After disposing of that idea as being not all it's cracked up to be, he moves on to find a woman to fall in love with. The vast majority of the story is about Kirker meeting women, and ultimately finding reasons to reject them all. And at the end, there's a twist. He was married with a devoted wife all along. The issues with this story, as they appear to today's readers, arise mostly from the modern view of misogyny and racism. At the time of the writing, it might have raised a few eyebrows, but certainly would not have been far outside the norms of the day, especially among men of Saroyan's age. The way Kirker treats the women is troubling, as he seems to be interested in finding a woman who is not intelligent, meets his standards for physical beauty, and is available to him. His use of the word girl to describe all women would also not fly so well today. Perhaps the most troubling aspect is the portion of the piece dedicated to Kirker and a Chinese woman he encounters. While including a Chinese character in a story such as this would have been rare for a non-Chinese writer at the time, though some California writers had started to open up to including non-white characters, Saroyan makes a couple of troubling statements. She might be almost anything but Japanese or Chinese. He also discusses her coloration, noting, "And to be sure, she was not at all yellow. Nor was she tan, but her complexion was like that of a white girl who had been in the sun a lot." That view of Asian women, and particularly the attraction to a Chinese woman so long as she appeared to be white, is a problematic view, and one that actually plays off a long-standard concept of whiteness being preferable to any other skin coloration. While the Asian communities of San Francisco received better treatment than most parts of the countries in the 1920s, there was still a bias against them within residents. In many ways, this persisted for decades. The entire idea of the search itself is problematic. He seems to treat the women he interacts with well, at least at first, but also appears to consider them as flat objects without emotions or backstory of their own. At the same time, he quickly develops paranoia surrounding some, or simply leaves them without contact, what today we'd call ghosting them. The general feeling of the story, especially after the reveal of his marital status, is that Kirker isn't actually looking for a partnership, but seemingly for someone to treat him as the center of their world. He wanted a girl to worship him, and sophisticated ladies worship not even God, let alone mere men. There is a possibility of this work being specifically a call-out to the reader. The idea of a young man wanting to find love is one of the classic stories, and we're presented with a somewhat prosaic form of it. We might even be rooting for Kirker, but then we are told he is a married man. And the way it's presented seems to indicate that Kirker took on this project while not maintaining his relationship with his wife and family. This is somewhat unclear, but it would have been difficult for him to do so much dating while still living with his wife and kids. Perhaps we're meant to turn on him, see his behavior as unacceptable. This might be a generous reading when you take the general treatment of women on his search into account, but it could be. Saroyan was never shy about using unlikable characters and bringing darker aspects of human behavior to light. Here, a reader could debate his intent, and perhaps he was trying to point out how often the audience for these kind of stories buys into the search for love without truly understanding what the full picture might be. And that certainly in the real world, there are almost always more complications. These themes, the search for love and the difficulties between men and women, pop up throughout Saroyan's oeuvre. The search for love is an element of many stories, including the human comedy, and the difficulty of finding and maintaining love in relationships is a major element of later works, like Boys and Girls Together, and many of his later short stories. Suicide also appears as a theme in several of his stories, notably The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze. In Saroyan's personal life, he had difficulty with women dating back to his youth. He was married twice to the same women, and, like Gordon Kirker, he had 2 children, a boy and a girl. The marriage was not a happy one, and there's little evidence of him having lasting romantic relationships that were. Of course, all of that would take place in the decades after he published this story. Stylistically, this story seems to fit in with Saroyan's future writing better than How to Write. Both share some themes, notably the idea of their story being a story. But in About a Man Who Wanted to Be in Love, the writing is more conversational, and there are many more of Saroyan's famous digressions. The voice here is clear, and you can see the elements that would become lauded with the release of Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze and Other Stories in 1934. One element that doesn't seem to exist in these early stories is the optimism tinged with melancholy that came to be called Saroyan-esque writing. These are more cynical works. The story first appeared in Boulevardier, a magazine that published several significant writers early in their careers, but was largely forgotten, save for the cocktail that bears its name. Saroyan himself seems to have forgotten about the fact that he published there. He would also say that Overland magazine was his first publication, though this may have been Saroyan wanting to highlight his association with that famous publication instead of the lesser-known Boulevardier. He was certainly aware of the stories, as in 1977 he wrote the Detroit Public Library requesting photocopies of the 4 stories that had appeared in the magazine. On the upper portion of the copy of About a Man Who Wanted to Be in Love appears, in Saroyan's clearly recognizable scrawl, Fresno, Friday, December 16, 1977, 1 p.m. First of 4 stories, published in Boulevardier, Detroit. This story might be a bit jarring for today's readers, but it does show the earliest portion of Saroyan's rise to literary excellence. Thank you for listening to From the Collection of Forever Saroyan. I'm Chris Garcia. See you next week.